In the green darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war. But why wait? War is happening in many parts of the world as we speak, and no place is more talked about than what is happening right now in Israel. As many of you may know, the International Court of Justice has just discussed allegations against Israel that it is committing a genocide in Gaza. Now, I am actually not going to get into the voodoo of the law exactly, like what everything means, but I do think that there is room here for an interesting philosophical discussion, which I would like to present to you. So the first thing that we should discuss is what is the definition of a genocide according to basically the UN, right? Because I believe that the definition itself exposes something that makes pinpointing genocide quite problematic, and I'm going to read it out to you. So a definition of genocide is any of 5 acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Meaning that if we want to consider Israel as committing genocide, we would need to prove that they are committing an act with intent to destroy a national or ethnical, religious, or whatever group. In this case, you could say the Palestinians, most likely. These 5 acts are 1. Killing members of the group, so that's obviously happening, right? Causing them serious bodily or mental harm. Imposing living conditions intended to destroy the group. This one is debatable. Preventing births, well, this is also probably true, but I don't know if it's intentional. Forcibly transferring children out of the group, well, that's also probably not intentional. But anyway, I think we can't really argue about the killing members of the group or causing them serious bodily or mental harm. All the other cases, well, you could argue for or against it, but I think these two we can't debate those. Those are obviously happening. So the question now really is the question of intent. But before we get into that, there are some more problematic things here that I think we should discuss. First of all, according to this definition, any time that someone kills members of a certain group with intent of targeting that group, that means that he's committed a genocide. Okay, so let's imagine a world in which all of us have different skin colors. Not that that's the case, but let's imagine that it is. Some people are green and some people are blue. And let's say that there's this blue person who really hates green people. So he takes a gun and he goes to a green people neighborhood and he starts shooting and he manages to kill, say, 3 of the other color, okay? And then he dies. The police get him, okay? He gets shot. So according to the UN definition of a genocide, this was a genocide, right? Because you have the intention, right? He intended on killing a specific group, in this case, a certain color of people. He did kill them, and he did it with intent of deliberately targeting this group of people. Now, almost none of us would agree. Like, something in our stomach tells us that this is not genocide. This shouldn't be considered a genocide. Sure, that guy, the perpetrator, is genocidal, right? But the act itself, was it a genocide? Well, it has like a certain elements of a genocide, but we can't exactly say that it was because the scale is just not large enough. In other words, I guess the problem with the UN definition of a genocide is that it doesn't take into account scale. So things like the Holocaust, things like the Holodomor in Ukraine back during the Soviet Union days, these are obviously not on par with the story I just made up about the green and the blue people. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, now we're going back to the Israel-Palestine case. How exactly do you define a group here, right? Because if you're going to accuse Israel of intentionally killing members of a group, which group is it going to be? Is it going to be Palestinians? In this case, I don't know if it's exactly a genocide, right? Because there are the Palestinians living in the West Bank and they're not being targeted. You might say that they're being occupied and they're living harsh lives, but it's harder to claim that Israel is trying to destroy them. And of course, there are also what is called by the Palestinians of 48, or by Israelis, the Israeli Arabs. These are the descendants of the Arabs that did not flee or were expelled during the war of 47 and 48. And these Palestinians are living in Israel and, living everyday lives among the Israelis. So it would be kind of weird to say that Israel is targeting a group when there are many members of the 48 Palestinian group participating in the so-called genocide. Now, you could also claim that Israel is only specifically targeting the Palestinians in Gaza, so that's what makes the genocide. But if that's the case, then could we also minimize groups every time it suits our needs? For example, can we say that Israel is targeting Hamas, it wants to eradicate Hamas, and for this reason it is committing genocide against the group Hamas, right? Or if you get in a gunfight with a gang, let's say, are you committing a genocide against this gang because you're intent on destroying the members of this group? Anyway, that's just some philosophical thinking about the subject. I'm not trying to do any law voodoo. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge. I'm not anything. Now, obviously, in order to keep discussing this, we have to think about the part of intention. That is, in order to prove that Israel is committing genocide, the suing party would have to prove that Israel intends to specifically target and do any of the 5 things, right, that consist genocide against the Palestinians. So mainly the accusations levied against Israel in this case are the quotes of its public figures. Now, some of the Israeli public figures let's put it this way, they've conducted themselves miserably with regards to their choice of words. But here we actually have 3 things to consider. We have the public sentiment in Israel, we have the government political interest, and we have the government geopolitical interest. And I'm going to discuss each one of these 3 briefly in order to show that it's really not that simple. So first, the public sentiment. The public sentiment in Israel post the 7th of October is very, very hostile towards anything related to Hamas in Gaza. Many people in Israel see many of the residents of Gaza as being involved in the massacre that occurred on the 7th of October. Some of the hostages that have returned to Israel in the hostage deals have actually said that many random people on the streets would come out and beat them and cooperate with the Hamas terrorists. And some of them were even held in private families' apartments, right? So in Israel, if a politician were to try to become more popular, he would probably try to say things that are against the entirety of the Gazan population. Okay? So that's not to say genocidal by definition, but things that would sound very bad to an outside ear. And that goes up to our second part of the discussion, the government political interest. So politicians have to conduct themselves in a certain manner to fit their roles, right? People in the opposition, they have to oppose the government, and the people in the government, they have to hold a certain line. And that line is influenced by the third part of our discussion, the government's geopolitical interest. Now, the geopolitical interest is entirely different from the public sentiment. Israel's geopolitical interests right now basically are to see this war as a broader conflict with Iran and its proxies. And the next natural move of Israel in this wider conflict is to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia will never normalize relations with Israel if Israel were to be seen as conducting a genocide in Gaza. So the Israeli politicians spent the first weeks of the war in a problematic position. On one hand, they had to, conduct themselves very aggressively against Gaza. And on the other hand, they couldn't be too aggressive. Otherwise, they would lose their long-term interests in basically normalizing relations with the Saudis. It is for this reason that I personally don't think that Israel intended on actually destroying the Palestinian population. But then again, if you define genocide as just killing members of a particular group, then I guess you could say that, yeah, I mean, people of a particular group did die, but it happens all the time, all over the world. And if killing members of a particular group counts as genocide, then obviously Hamas committed genocide on the 7th of October. But Hamas is not a state, so it wasn't the one standing trial, and it also can't stand trial because the ICJ is only for states. So what's going to happen in the future? I suspect that Israel is going to abide by its long-term interests. That is, to solve the problem in Gaza, that is, removing the terrorist organization. They will probably not try to kick out the Palestinians. They can't probably do it either. But it's important to understand that Israel has a strategic interest in minimizing civilian casualties so that they could go on with their normalization plans with the Saudis so that they have a better way to counter Iran in the region. So I just wanted to talk about that for a little bit, and the end.